Welcome, Patreon members. This is Myster Spock. This is also the March Q&A for everybody. I am here today to give you a Q&A on electricity and the telegraph system specifically. We had a question that came in from one of our Patreon members asking in more detail about the telegraph and some of the history behind it, as well as some of like EMF exposures, electro-sensitivities, this sort of stuff. This has, of course, been Myster Spock's world for forever. Even at the age of 13, I remember seeing waves and flashes and spots in my vision a long time ago, and can think back to those days about how EMFs had been affecting my life. But interestingly enough, as you can see around me, I'm in a bedroom here, my bedroom, and the walls, as you can imagine, have electricity flowing through them when the power's on. Of course, this computer's on, which is way over here and mitigated. But this lamp you see behind you, this lamp, normally everyone would have it plugged in, right? Well, I have this lamp unplugged, as you can see. And I only use the lamp and plug in the lamp when I need the lamp. Why? Because electricity, even when the walls are on, right, like the plug's on, when this is plugged in, I'm just connecting the electric flow through the wire. So the electric field is in everything around you, even if it's turned off, right? So the lamp, if I had this lamp turned off, but it's plugged into my wall, this wire carries an electric field with it. And if it's in my space, right, the fields that emanate even off the wire, this is a two-pronged plug, as you can see. So it doesn't have a ground that helps the flow, with the electric field, pulling that ground current back in through the power grid. So as a two-pronged piece of equipment, I definitely don't like to have this thing plugged in if it's in my local space around me, because the fields that can come off it, before the inverse square law pulls the field away off of a wire like this, it could be, out to about here. It could be a good foot, 2 feet away until the field strength really falls off to almost immeasurable at that point. But the funny thing enough is the electric and magnetic fields of the ELFs, the extremely low frequency fields, they actually have a wavelength that is like the size of a football field. It's like 5,000 or 6,000 meters long, that comes off of these things, believe it or not, because they're only either 50 or 60 hertz. So even though they're enormous giant fields that are generated from them, they have a very small inverse field fall off. So if I had this plugged into the wall and I'm a good like 3 or 4 feet away from this wire, it's not really even a concern to me. It won't even affect any of my ES. However, if I were to sleep in my bed over there at night, that bed is actually pulled a foot away from the wall. If I sit in the bed before I turn off the power to the room at night, then the reason why it's pulled out a foot from the wall is if I'm doing stuff on the bed, like playing cards or something, I still am not in any field generation around the bed area. So it's really important to think about the fields as like an electric field is kind of like the backup pressure that goes through things. So like I was saying, if this lamp is plugged in but the lamp is off, it's almost like a faucet when you have the water pressure in the faucet, and you don't have that faucet turned on, but you still have this water coming all the way to the tip of where the faucet could turn on the water. Everything up to that point has a field associated with it, and there's an electromagnetic field generation away from all that pressure in that wire in that faucet or from a motor or whatever. So electric fields are around us all the time. And I'm talking to you about this because I'm going to get into the telegraph a little bit with this right now as well. But just to also let you guys know, magnetic fields appear like when you turn on the faucet and the water's running. A magnetic field 90 degrees perpendicular to the electric field appears from the source with the electric field. So when a magnetic field is on, you have both the generation of the electric field from the power source as well as the magnetic field showing up at the same time. And it's kind of like double the fun, double the not fun if you have electrosensitivity. So magnetic fields generally are not a good thing. And magnetic fields are also kind of weird because in many giant spaces, you could have two different grounding systems that have a resistance between them that across a field, or like when the neutral and the hot from the electrical system are separated, you can generate extra magnetic fields. And I'm talking like magnetic fields that are in really wide spaces, like across an acre to across a property. A good example would be like if you have an electric or like a grounding system that's attached to your water pipes, and the water pipes then create a conductor throughout your entire property with the water pipes, and then there's another grounding system that creates resistance. You can actually have a large volumetric area of magnetic fields across your property. And this is what a lot of people with electrosensitivities don't even think about or realize, that so some of the more subtle responses to these fields can be in your environments. Some properties just have almost zero magnetic field background. Other properties have way higher magnetic field background. The typical property I've measured here in the United States is somewhere between 0.5 milligauss to 1.5 milligauss. And you can turn on the extreme sensitivity on any of the lower grade meters to see how much magnetic field is coming in across an area. So I've even seen really bad situations where there's 3, 4, 5 milligauss of magnetic fields just going through an entire space, because they might have higher power lines or higher voltage power lines or other power lines that kind of are close to their property and close to their houses. There's a case over here about, I would say, maybe 800 feet away from me. There's power lines way on the other side of the street. Actually, it's closer than that. It's probably more like 400 feet away. But there's power lines going across the street, and when I take my meter and I measure out there and I measure under the power lines, I get about 12 milligauss. When I go and walk alongside a house, it goes from 12 milligauss down to about 4 milligauss into the front yards of their house. So I know that they're getting fields from somewhere between 12 to 4 milligauss of magnetic fields just going through their house and through their property because of being very close to a major power line. So this is the kind of shenanigans we have in our modern world, where you buy and what your house is located in with all these fields can be everything for your health over time. Because even if you're not electrosensitive, it's creating more oxidative stress, aging you faster, just not healthy to be in, especially when you're trying to regenerate. And here we go now into the telegraph systems. So back by the 1850s, not the 1950s, into the 1850s, we had 6 of the 7 continents already electrified in major cities with the telegraph systems. The telegraph, as most people know and most people have been taught, are DC systems, which means direct current systems. That means 0 hertz in theory. This is what we're going to talk about, because a lot of diseases, electrosensitivities, all kinds of problems were way documented in the past by the 1880s, where many doctors were seeing problems with patients that have a whole range of symptoms and problems. So there's a book called The Invisible Rainbow, and this is it, and it's by Arthur Firstenberg. You can't order this online like on major places. I think you have to order it direct through him. And when the book came out this time last year, I ordered it directly through him because I really respect this guy and he's very knowledgeable. And after I read the book, I didn't realize how knowledgeable he was and all the data collection he really figured out about the telegraph. So if you really want massive details about the telegraph, get this book. I am going to kind of give you an overview about what he says about it in here, and there's some really startling, eye-opening things in it. So just to let you know, in 1859, the city of London had telegraph lines all through the cities because all the telegraph companies were obviously wanting to communicate to businesses and just get their business entrepreneurship stuff going. And telegraph lines were being placed. They're trying to figure out how to place telegraph lines through the city. So they started talking with neighbors, residents, people, just normal people living in a normal house, and to rent out their roof space for them. And a lot of these telegraph companies, this is in the the mid 19th century, in the mid 1800s, in London, all these homes started having all these wires appear on top of their houses. And at first thought, if it's a DC field generation, even if it is electric fields and magnetic fields being generated from these DC systems, it looked like during that 30 years from about 1850 to 1880, there was all kinds of new problems showing up with people that were exposed to the telegraph lines or the telegraph workers or people, especially that were in like the train, like that were train engineers, people that were working around the train systems because they would run the telegraph lines along the train tracks because it was very efficient that way. And it was kind of like killing two birds with one stone by having a rail system and then also your telegraph system. Then you can communicate between the train engineer and how all the line people are working with obviously having the lines right there on the tracks. So also people in passenger cars that were around the telegraph lines over time had also reported having problems. So that's what this book goes into, and it's quite intriguing, where we start to learn that, and even Charles Dickens wrote about what London looked like, having sometimes several 50 to 100 or several hundred lines just dotting the landscape. And you could look across the roof lines or through a city street, and the streets are like shaded more because there's so many wires coming through them. As a matter of fact, there's a picture in here. Here it is. I just flipped to it. There's a picture in here that shows what is going on, like on one telegraph pole. There could be like up to the order of like several dozen lines, and the city streets are just like you can see up above in this picture. The city streets have so many wires across them. It actually blocks sunlight down to the street. There's so many wires. It looks like, Myster Spock in the past has called this like artificial floss for the city, where the telegraph companies have been like flossing the streets of across the entire world. And like I was saying earlier, by about like the late 1880s, like literally every continent except for Antarctica had major cities with this kind of like telegraph stuff going on. So what we found out, though, is there was a man named Dr. Beard, and his name's George Miller Beard. And he classified all the symptoms of people that were exposed to this. For some reason, these DC power lines, DC telegraph lines, not power lines, but the telegraph lines. He said that there was a name he gave all the conditions of the people that he experienced that had problems with this, which he called at that time weak nerves. And weak nerves is translated into neurasthenia. It's a kind of a hard word to pronounce, but neurasthenia, basically, I'll just read this. It says, although some of its symptoms resembled other diseases, neurasthenia seemed to attack at random and for no reason, and no one was expected to die from it. Beard certainly didn't connect the disease with electricity, which was actually his preferred treatment of neurasthenia when the patient could tolerate it. So what we see here is that what you don't know, and what this book, The Invisible Rainbow, gets into from the 1750s through the 1850s, is that once the Leyden jar was created, we saw the influx of like all of these people in the medical industry at that time. All the all the doctors and people decided to start using electricity to treat people by actually using like little batteries, like from Volta, right, that was created back in the day. They would create an electric shock in people, and the short-term effect of the electric shock, some people would go and get the electric shock and then walk away and feel better after an electric shock. Other people, of course, felt worse, but it was like a way that doctors could kind of like trial and error and see that, oh, I give an electric shock to this person, somehow they feel better afterwards, or they're saying they feel better. Some of this can totally be, chalked up to, just the placebo effect, where they think they're being cured and they go and they get shocked. Or it could be actually a real thing where maybe there was something wrong in their system. There was some neurological problem. You get some massive shock. It's somehow the body gets a hermetic effect off the shock, and then over time it can have a curing effect in the short term. However, they had no idea about oxidative stress. They had no idea that this could, blow, really harm myelin sheaths, right? They had no idea like all of the other, mechanisms in the body, which you don't want to be electrocuted or shocked. But the doctors back from the 1750s through the 1850s were using this as a treatment method, including this guy Beard. So because he was using it as a treating method, just like Benjamin Franklin did as well, like it's quite interesting to see like when some of these telegraph lines also came into the scene, because here we see a passage that pretty much is the shocker of this Q&A. And I'm going to just go ahead and read these next few paragraphs so you understand what we're dealing with the telegraph that everyone believes is a DC system that's actually an AC producing system in a way that really affects human biology. So 20-foot high wooden poles supported with wires on their journeys between towns. As we saw, I showed you that picture before, you could see all the telegraph lines, right? In cities where multiple telegraph companies competed for customers and space was at a premium, forests of overhead wires tangled their ways between housetops, church steeples, and chimneys, to which they attached themselves like vines. And from those vines hung electric fields that blanketed the streets and byways and the spaces within the homes to which they clung. Okay, so he's like, Firstenberg is giving you the imagery that the way the world looked 200 years ago is radically different than today, because the wires, like I was saying, that's in this wall behind me, the wires that are around us have gone spy-like, incognito. They're hidden. They're not here where you see them, but they're here. They might go under your house. right? They buried in the ground. They're in your walls. They're plugged in when you are actively charging a device. They're out on the streets, and these like the fields from them, even though they're very weak, you can still detect them even a quite far distance away, even if the intensity has fallen off. So our cells in our bodies, it's like none other time ever before where our cells have always been experiencing this 50, 60 hertz pulsation like 24/7 in our world, unless you really can find your way off and away from the power grid and into nature and really resonating back with frequency again. The sad thing is that NASA and other companies like like Boeing and I think the Lockheed Martin especially, they were like running experiments even back in the early 2000s where they were trying to do an experiment, electromagnetic experiment from like in the lower atmospheres of Earth. And even then they were having problems even running their experiments, and they had to just cancel all their experiments because the entire Earth has this larger pulsation now of a background 50 hertz, 60 hertz pulse that the Earth itself is just experiencing because of what we do on the surface of the planet. It's just like the experiment that we're doing in this regard is just so undercover and is so hidden. And because it's invisible, nobody's thinking about it. 100 years from now, it will be a whole different situation when the entire world wakes up to it, and how we try to like mitigate what we've done and do things more insulated to protect life. Okay, so this is why. So it says, the historic numbers provide a clue as to what happened. He's talking about now the telegraph lines. So according to George Prescott's 1860 book on the electric telegraph, a typical battery used for a 100-mile length of wire in the United States was a 50 cups of Grove, or 50 pairs of zinc and platinum plates, which provided an electric potential of about 80 volts. In the earliest systems, the current only flowed when the telegraph operator pressed the sending key. So get this. So in the earliest systems, the telegraph operator would press the send key, and that's when the current flowed. All right. There were 5 letters per word in the Morse alphabet, an average of 3 dots or dashes per letter. Therefore, so he's calculating all this right now. Therefore, if the telegraph operator was proficient in average 30 words per minute, almost like your typing speed, right? 30 words per minute, then she pressed a key at a rhythm of 7.5 strokes per second. This is the very near the fundamental resonance of the Schumann frequency, 7.8 of the biosphere, right? To which all living things, as well as we will see in chapter 9, are tuned. We're tuned to the 7.8 hertz frequency. So he also says, and whose average strength, about 1/3 of a millivolt per meter, is given in the textbooks. This is from the 1860s. It is easy to calculate using these simple assumptions that the electric fields beneath the earliest telegraph wires were up to 30,000 times stronger than the natural electric field of the Earth at that frequency. 30,000 times more than Earth's strengths of Earth's electric field at 7.8 hertz. In reality, the rapid interruptions in the telegraph keying also produced a wide range of radio frequency harmonics, which also traveled along the wires and radiated through the air. So this is what he's saying here, is that not only was the telegraph operator like upping the DC hertz from 0 hertz up to 7.8 hertz, there's harmonics, there's radio frequencies also coming off of these lines as they were being used. And like, this is what, in a nutshell, what he's also saying. I'm interpreting this right now, but what he's kind of saying to us is that this is kind of what like dirty electricity is. Dirty electricity are different transients and harmonics that come off of our wires, and also, you know, often go up into the kilohertz range, even up into the megahertz range, which megahertz, as you know, that's our, like our phone, you know, 100, it's a million hertz basically, or more, right? And into the megahertz, where kilohertz is 1,000. So we're talking like these transients can still have been generated back at that time, back in that day, in the 1800s. So that's when we see this neurasthenia showing up, is when the telegraphs came in. It's not a DC system. Telegraph is not DC, according to Firstenberg and his researcher. It says the magnetic fields also can be estimated off of these based on the values for the electrical resistance for the wires and insulators as given by Samuel Morse himself. And he has it, you know, quoted out of like a reference. The amount of current on a typical long distance wire varied from about 0.015 ampere to 0.1 ampere, depending on the length of the line and the weather. Since the insulation was imperfect, some current escaped down each telegraph pole into the earth, a flow which increased when it rained. Then, using the published value of 10 to the minus 8th Gauss for the magnetic field of the Earth at 8 Hertz, one may calculate that the magnetic field from a single early telegraph wire would have exceeded the Earth's natural magnetic field at that frequency for a distance of 2 to 12 miles on either side of that line. 2 to 12 miles. And since the Earth is not uniform, but contains underground streams, iron deposits, and other conductive paths over which the return current would travel, exposure of the population to these new fields varied widely. So there you go. This is the interesting part of what we are dealing with. We're dealing with this today. What your neighbors do with their solar panels to generate harmonics from their inverters when they're actually returning power back to the back to the power grid, or when you have high powered lines coming through an area even a mile away, you're still exceeding intensities, at least larger than the Earth's background field. So what is your body going to be tuned to over longer periods of time as you live your life? I think this in part has to do with a lot of people that have electrosensitivities, where some people that get stuck in the same home, in the same area, with the same field strength 24/7, they are probably more likely to slowly become tuned to their local environments. I have this, like, it's not even a hypothesis, it's more of like my own wild theory, my own imaginative ideas, but I'm thinking people that are more on the go, that have more of an active lifestyle and just move around, get out more, get away from the same spaces that they live in, travel more, even in this world just filled with EMF garbage everywhere we look, their bodies might not be tuning themselves as much to different frequencies, although we have a big problem with just our power grid because it's 60 hertz here in the US, or 50 hertz down in, I think, Australia, and 50 hertz. And it's actually in Japan, it's a combination of 50 and 60 hertz, depending on where you live. In Europe, it's 50 hertz. So, like, depending on where you live, if you have, let's say, an electrosensitivity, it might be even an interesting experiment that if you are tuned to 50 hertz, in Great Britain and you decide to take a trip to the US, and a week or two after you get here to the US, you suddenly feel way better, your problem might not be all the harmonics, transients, microwave, and all that other stuff going on, as much as just how you've been attuned to the extremely low frequencies. So it all matters. Like, to say all the new 5G stuff coming out is a big problem. Yeah, of course it's a big problem, but your bigger problem might be your power, the power grid that we've had for the last 200 years in your environments as well. Like, all of this stuff is a problem. It's like you can't just say one little slice wedge of the whole thing is the problem. Now, it's going to be a bigger problem to everybody because the exposure potential and the intensities are just driving up through the roof. The proliferation of all this is going bazonkers with 5G. But then we've had all this since 4G, 3G, 2G, 1G. I mean, we've had 1G since the Telegraph. You just read that. I just read that. 1G, harmonics, transients, up into way higher hertz rates, right? Way back in the day. So we can't dismiss that we've been exposed to these things for a really long time. And now with power densities increasing, because there's going to be even a deeper power drain, a need for more power for 5G, for like all these small cells on every corner, all this stuff is just going to add to the overall soup of the lower energy power grid. And there you have it. You have now everyone around, like if you're living on it, near it, close to it, and you don't get out and you don't use nature, it's going to be a big problem for everyone if you have lots of exposure and higher intensities going on as we roll into the next decade. So keep that in mind. So here's what happened. Here's why this weak nerves syndrome called neurasthenia was diminished and pretty much not used here in the US, and it's going to shock you again what is going on. So in 1894, an up-and-coming Viennese psychiatrist wrote a paper whose influence was enormous and whose consequences for those who came after have been profound and unfortunate. That's people with ES especially. Because of him, neurasthenia, which is still the most common illness of our day, is accepted as a normal element of now the human condition. Firstenberg is very brilliant for him to realize that. We have all accepted, I just have to go into this, we have all accepted that all of these things we live with on a daily basis are just part of the human condition, but this was not part of the human condition 200 plus years ago before this. Like, and he's going to get into like what all the symptoms are of what we have now come to call normal that didn't used to be normal, you know, in the days of the Leyden jar and before that. So now nobody is seeking an external cause for this, right? Nobody's thinking about that the environment itself is exposing you, like you living in a dirty fish tank. Because of this psychiatrist, environmental illness, that is, illness caused by a toxic environment, is widely thought not to exist. This was in 1894. Its symptoms automatically blamed on disordered thoughts and out of control emotions. Of course, that's what a psychiatrist might think, right? Because of this psychiatrist, we are today putting millions of people on Xanax, Prozac, and Zoloft instead of cleaning up their environment. For over a century ago, at the dawn of an era that blessed the use of electricity full throttle, not just for communication, but for light, power, and traction, this psychiatrist, Sigmund Freud, renamed neurasthenia as anxiety neurosis instead of weak nerves. And it's crisis when it happens as anxiety attacks. So when you hear like a person's having an anxiety attack, it might be a good idea to think about what EMFs might be in that environment. Today, we call these same anxiety attacks as panic attacks. Thank you, Sigmund Freud. The symptoms listed by Freud, in addition to anxiety, will be familiar to every doctor, every anxiety patient, and every person with electrical sensitivities. These are irritability or mood swings, right? Heart palpitations, arrhythmias, and chest pain, shortness of breath and asthma attacks, perspiration, tremor and shivering, ravenous hunger, diabetes and obesity related people, diarrhea, vertigo, vasomotor disturbances, meaning the flushing of the skin or cold extremities, right? Numbness and tingling, insomnia, nausea and vomiting, frequent urination, again, this is like so interrelated to so many diseases we know today. Rheumatic pains, like rheumatoid arthritis kind of pains, weakness and exhaustion, or just lethargy, right? So Freud ended the search for a physical cause of neurasthenia by reclassifying it as a mental disease. And then by designating almost all cases of it as anxiety neurosis, he signed its death warrant. Although he pretended to leave neurasthenia with a separate neurosis, he didn't leave it many symptoms, and in Western countries it has been all but forgotten. In some circles, it persists as chronic fatigue syndrome, a disease without a cause that many doctors believe is also psychological, and that most don't take seriously. Neurasthenia survives in the United States only in the common expression nervous breakdown, whose origin few people remember. In the International Classification of Diseases, the ICD-10, there is a unique code for neurasthenia, F48.0, but in the version used in the United States, this has been removed. In the American version, neurasthenia is not one among a list of other non-psychotic mental disorders and is almost never diagnosed. So I'm just going to leave it there, how we got here. We had a time when nobody understood how EMFs could impact life, and then people chalked them up to mental illnesses, emotional swings, all these other things. And then we get Freud coming along, who establishes this paradigm about how like all these symptoms happen. And what's also interesting is people that are electrosensitive, and you read this in Firstenberg's book, people that are electrosensitive actually have a longer lifespan on average than other people, which is kind of interesting. Like there's maybe something else going on. I mean, it's not too many more years, but it's quite interesting. In that timeline, people like back in the 1800s had a slightly longer like age effect, but I'm wondering like the exposure that people had to this, right? They were mainly getting exposed to the lower frequencies, and they probably had times where, you know, who knows what was happening, but we know that the way people had to live in their lives, they would get outside, they would get nature's frequency, they would be attuned to the sun, they'd be attuned to the earth. And with this added non-native EMF source into their lives with the telegraph wires, and then by the 1890s is when, like, you know, all the DC and the new AC systems are starting to come in on power lines. That was not measured as to why people were like living. I think it was actually. I think that with the power lines, I think some of the studies went up to about the 1940s to see like why people would live a little longer. But what we can see from this is just like anything, you use a little tiny bit of a poison for periods of time, it can actually help the body move and resolve things as like a hermetic effect. So my thoughts on this, just my personal thoughts, is yes, it's possible people that are exposed to these things like hear a little bit. It's like our body needs to adapt and to adjust, and then we become a little stronger from it. But then if you're chronically exposed to it, you've got these things in your home and you live a way where you're just constantly around it, and you don't let your body adjust, you don't move your body, you're just there absorbing these things, then you get the added oxidative stress, you get the melatonin regression and stifling. You don't get the sunlight if you're indoors too much, so you don't get vitamin D production. All of everything else, like our water supply, our food supply, what's in and coming into our bodies is like also toxic. It's also giving us oxidative stress in our modern world compared to that timeline back like 200 years ago or 100 years ago even. So like there's so much synergy of things added in on top of this world in the last, especially like the last 50 years, even in especially like the last 10, 20 years, that the environmental soup we live in is now becoming a very important consideration, maybe as important as the patient's history, the patient's family, everything about the patient. Like you can have an argument that the environment they're living in could be far more impactful than the things we label ourselves as. Like some people get a genetic diagnosis, and like I know my eyes like have a genetic problem with them, but like I'm the soup I'm living in, I notice that makes all the difference in the world to how my eye health is. If I'm out in nature all the time, I get no eye issues. It's only when I do the wrong things, I sleep in, I stay up late, I get blue light into my eyes, which blue light's a very powerful problem as well, as we know. You get like all these frequencies coming in off of the other EMF sources, all the harmonics, all the higher frequencies that people have they use their cell phones like close to them all the time. Like it's all the added synergy, the invisible stuff in our environment that's going unnoticed and nobody knows it's there. It's like, taking a Twinkie from 1974 and looking at the ingredients on the package. You see 5 ingredients. I mean, you see cream, sugar, milk, salt, and water. That's it. That's how they made a Twinkie a long time ago. And then if you looked at a Twinkie from 2014, you see it's got like 30 or 40 ingredients in it, of which most of them you can't pronounce because they're putting in all these fillers, all these dyes, all these additives, all these preservatives, all these things that are completely dead and unnatural and that we don't even need. And they're partially doing it to addict you to it. But it's like a Twinkie from 1974 is already addictive. I don't know why they would even want to change the formula. Anyway, it's my own personal thing. So it's what's going on. It's like you look at a Twinkie from 1974 and you look at a Twinkie from 2014, and to the naked eye, they look identical. You're like, well, this is a Twinkie, this is a Twinkie. They look the same. Why are they any different? Well, it's because the invisibility of the ingredients of what you're getting into your body, and those ingredients could be harmonics and transients and the EMFs, that if you don't have a meter and you don't know what's going on, of course you're just going to think that, well, it's the air around me is just the same. If I sit over on the other side of the room, it's not going to be any different. But yeah, what if there's your like smart meter on the other side of the room and you're now getting like 10,000 times more EMF exposure just because you're 10 feet over on the other side of the room? All of this makes a difference. And just to like end this Q&A that's gone on a really, really, really long time, which I hope you guys are enjoying, it's like we have to start diving in back to Becker's works. And Firstenberg actually talks about Becker. I don't know why I'm like saying this book, get this book. I haven't said get this book, but like I learned a lot from this book. It's a great book. So don't underestimate it. There's a ton of, like, any family member that were to read this book, they would have their eyes completely opened to what's going on with EMFs. But he talks about Becker in this book, and Becker, right, he found the DC pulsed, analog electrical system inside of all life, inside of salamanders. That's what he was researching, but it's in humans too. And like to regenerate bone, to regenerate nerves, to like do these type of regenerative frequencies, we as humans, as life on the planet, we use this lower hertz rate part of the spectrum. We use like 1 hertz to like especially 30 range specifically for like regeneration programs, to like regenerate different organs, to regenerate different tissues. And it's very important that our bodies attune to those lower harmonics so we don't have these frequencies blocked. And that's the takeaway, is that when we generate all this other garbage out there, we could be blocking our own regeneration programs in our bodies. So a lot of these problems that show up over longer periods of time. So this is like the number one thing that would be really helpful to learn about if you want to know about regeneration, about your nerves and everything else, is to like look up what Becker wrote about Schwann cells, or look up like your myelin, how myelinated your neurons can get, because the Schwann cells and the myelination all contribute to how insulated you are. Ole Johansson in 2016 had a paper on PubMed about linking EHS and electro-sensitivities to the lack of myelin, or the myelin degeneration, or it's called demyelination in people over longer periods of time. So if we cannot regenerate and build our myelin properly, especially in our kids that take a really long time to myelinate. I mean, we're talking decades for them to myelinate their nerves so they're not as sensitive. They're not exposed to the elements. I mean, we all know children are very pliable and sensitive and emotionally sensitive. And it makes a lot of sense if you think about, like, if their nerves are just exposed and they're just like, like just jumpy and like just doing things all the time, it only makes sense that they don't have insulation, they don't have myelin, they don't have these coatings to resist our environments, right, that are coming in. And this isn't even getting into anything deep in the mitochondria yet, with how our mitochondria is generating energy, or how the energy is being diminished. So then the cells over time like don't function as they should, which also feeds in right to the whole regenerative process, because this even gets into stem cells, and like when our body wants to tap the stem cells to make new cells because our other cells are being overly taxed with all this constant stuff going on. So it sounds like I'm painting a little bit of a dark picture, but the light at the end of the tunnel is this: letting the public know we need to regenerate. Like, fundamentally, there will be probably people marching on the streets 10 years from now saying, I demand that I have the ability to regenerate my cells, because they'll have figured out that the frequencies are blocking their regeneration potential. And depending on where they live, like in your home, you might need to like continuously move around your bed even, to find a place where you just feel good and you can sleep soundly at night. Because if you can get into that REM deep sleep, you're doing it. You're generating. You're getting into that real deeper state where your body can go through and tell everything from your brainstem down through your organs everywhere else to like want to regenerate the organs properly and go through their cell cycles and everything. So the stalling of this, when cells don't regenerate or they get stuck and they can't go through apoptosis, programmed cell death, then this is where we see all kinds of disease expressions come from. I mean, that's one of the number one signs is hey, wait a minute, guys, our cells can't like create daughter cells again, right? And like create all new cells fresh, which is apoptosis, or like clean out the cells with autophagy, or clean out the mitochondria with mitophagy. So to preserve each cell unit and to get them all strengthened and everything up, it's like just spend more time in nature is a really great strategy that Myster Spock uses. I try to get out in the morning more. I try to like not have all these artificial sources at night, and I just know my area by with just a few simple meters can let you know like if an area is just overly saturated in EMF or undersaturated, it's like lower, and you might have a better time finding a regenerative space and finding a good sleeping environment. So there you go. The Telegraph, our world. It'd be an interesting experiment if we could have a time machine and go back like 300 years and to see what we'd feel from environments. It'd be really interesting to know if humans could actually sense like even like ley lines, right? Like the geopathing stuff, where the way the stuff in the earth itself and the currents, the fields of the earth, we could maybe even have sensed it back then if we weren't attuned and the world wasn't like covered with this whole envelope of EMFs that we have today on the surface from all of our artificial sources. So I hope this was an awesome Q&A. I want to do more like this in the future. I'll like span all over the biophysics or biology or to the physics or wherever you guys want to take it, or even into other subjects. So it's up to you guys. I want to have this as a community so we can talk about all of these things in more detail and just start getting it out to people, because I feel that it's kind of the bigger cover up, right? That's been happening forever, but it's kind of a weird cover up because it wasn't intentional at first. Even Freud, right? Even Tesla, they didn't know the ramifications. They were just trying to like figure out what was going on, but now it's got to stop. Like we have to like reverse what they did. At some point, somebody's got to rise up and call these people out that still like think that Freud was correct, or when you can actually just measure, right, environments, you can see what's going on with kid. Like if you have a hyperactive kid or somebody that's like got real issues, I mean, just think about their environment first before that person and what environments they're living in, and then maybe sneak measure with an EMF meter and see what's going on and see if that has an impact, and then get that kid. Let's say if you get that kid out of that environment for, I don't know, like a few weeks, see how that kid is acting, reacting, because you can differentiate between like just sudden events, of psychology versus like patterned learned behaviors over time. And if you're aware enough to distinguish between them, you might just find out 90% of the kids' problems are not behavioral at all. It has to do with their environments they're in. I found that out with my kid. I've seen that with other kids. So it's really fun and interesting. Well, not fun, but it's interesting to know why you can see problems that happening, but you can put more fun into a kid's life by getting them out of all this garbage that we've created as humans. So it's pretty simple. I guess that's, maybe a whole other subject we can get into is like how we distinguish and how we become more aware of things to just, help our health and help our lives. All right, guys, it's been fun. I hope you enjoyed this. And next month, April, should be fun. You give me some suggestions. All right, guys, see you later.